Welcome to Radio Free Humanity, the Marxist-Humanist podcast. On this week's podcast, we bring you an unaired interview from the Vault, which Andrew and I recorded in 2019. This may be one of my favorite discussions we've had since we started the podcast, so I'm glad it will finally be seeing the light of day. We will be discussing a paper that co-host Andrew Kleiman wrote back in 2006 about some of the unanswered and seldom discussed theoretical problems that would arise in the construction of a society which attempts to break from the capitalist mode of production. The paper is entitled Not by Politics Alone, and you can find it on Marxist-Humanist-Initiative.org. Andrew argues in the paper that these problems won't be solved merely by building left organizations or recruiting members. They require some actual thinking, and we will be doing some of that actual thinking on this podcast. You are listening to Radio Free Humanity, the Marxist-Humanist podcast. My name is Brendan Cooney.
And I'm Andrew Kleiman.
To hear more episodes, read more about the issues discussed, or to join in the conversation, please do visit Marxist-Humanist-Initiative.org. You can also make a donation to the podcast there on the website. While our podcast is hosted by MHI, the views expressed by the co-hosts and guests of Radio Free Humanity are their own. They do not necessarily reflect the views and positions of MHI. In just a moment, we will commence our main segment discussing Andrew's paper, Not by Politics Alone. But first, as we do in every episode, we're going to take a few minutes to discuss some current events. So we are recording this current event section on Wednesday, July 15th. We're going to be talking about the state of the pandemic and this issue of schools reopening. Just to put some things in perspective, Italy is now reporting around 200 new cases of coronavirus a day. Germany 400, whereas in the U.S., Texas had 9,000 a day a few days ago. Florida had 15,000 a day a few days ago. So the U.S. crisis is accelerating rapidly while other countries are safely reopening to various extents. Trump's plan is to force life to return to normal by pretending the virus isn't there. And this is all happening in the U.S. as schools are set to open in a few weeks, returning from summer vacation, and people are trying to figure out what to do. And because there's no national plan in the U.S., it's up to governors and mayors and school districts to make their own plans and to evaluate on their own what's safe and what isn't safe. And for parents and teachers to also have to figure out on their own what they feel is safe.
You're a parent with school-age kids, Brendan.
Yeah.
And you're going to be confronting this situation very soon. How does this whole push to reopen the schools in the U.S. Being pushed very hard by Trump and his people, how does this strike you, and how are you going to react to it if they basically try to force the schools open?
Well, we've decided personally that we're going to homeschool our kids for the next year. It's not easy, but we've been doing it already since the lockdown started, and we decided it is manageable. I work from home, and I am very flexible with my schedule, and so we decided this is the best solution for us. And we also just thought it was the safest solution. We're very worried that when schools reopen, it's going to be a real shit show, and it's going to spread this virus around like crazy. There is a narrative out there that kids don't spread this coronavirus as much as adults do. I'm very skeptical of that narrative. I mean, I've heard it from doctors, and there's some data behind it. So I don't want to, sound like I'm being anti-science or something. But with every other sickness, from my experience, kids spread it like crazy in schools. For anyone has been a parent of a school-age kid, they know that from the first day of school through the whole school year, someone is, there's germs in the house all the time. People are getting sick. I mean, for our family, it's the entire school year somebody's sick because of the germs that are bouncing right into school. So it's hard for me to imagine that this one virus is so different that somehow kids don't spread it, but everyone else does.
Right. I mean, look, it's a novel coronavirus. Nothing was known about it because it was new, and they're still finding out a lot about it. And in a situation like that, you're bound to make mistakes, but what you should do is err on the side of caution. But that's if you care about human life, right? Which is the real issue here. Especially in the southern United States, and especially if you're opening in late August, right? You got air conditioning everywhere. You got the same air circulating again and again and again with filters that may or may not probably don't catch this, and the kids are there. It makes absolutely no sense to me. I mean, you got 6 year olds, 7 year olds, 8 year olds. You're going to tell them to social distance,
And wear masks and face shields all day.
even if you can get them to wear masks. The idea that you're going to keep them apart is just nuts. So I think people realize this. So even the Trumpites realize this. I mean, what this is showing me is this profound indifference to human life. The question is, and I'm not sure everybody really understands this. I'm not sure I entirely understand it. Why are they doing this? Why are they so insistent on forcing the schools to reopen? I mean, do these people value education and expertise and stuff? It's not what I think, right?
I mean, we should say that people want schools to reopen, and they have a lot of rational reasons to want schools to reopen. I mean, this schools being closed is taking a real emotional, financial, psychological, economic toll on society. It's wrecking people's relationships with their families and their emotional stability. Kids' educations are being compromised. They're not getting the socialization they need for their emotional development. A lot of kids are not getting enough food to eat because they rely on school lunch programs for their meals. All of the inequalities we have around education in this country are being amplified. We have to acknowledge that schools being closed is a major problem for our society. But the problem is there just don't seem to be safe ways to open most schools, and at least in a lot of parts of the country. Some of the people I feel for the most are the teachers. I mean, these are people who did not sign up for this gig. They already have a hard job, and this was not what they signed up for. I mean, they already had to completely redesign their curriculums at the drop of a hat back in the spring, which was hard for them to do. It was a completely new set of skills they had to learn like overnight. And then they had to suffer the criticism from all the people who complained about how shitty remote learning has been. And now they're being asked to do both. They have to reopen schools and take the personal health risks, and they have to create and manage this online content. And on the side of the personal health risks, I mean, like here in Philadelphia, over 70% of the teachers are over 50. So, there's there's a lot of reasons they should be worried for their own safety going into school. But they also have to run the classroom and keep everyone safe somehow in these complicated, underfunded, dilapidated buildings. I mean, here in Philadelphia, you already have problems with lead and asbestos in all the schools. We have, a severe lack of health staff, often a shortage of basic supplies like toilet paper, let alone textbooks. And now, in Philadelphia, they decided the schools are going to be open just 2 days a week. They just called this morning, which means the teachers are going to be having students rotating through their classroom throughout the week, and they're going to be managing their remote learning at the same time. So as far as I can tell, it sounds like twice as much work.
Yeah, it's very bad. I mean, will they go for it? I mean, it's not even possible to do.
I think a lot of teachers are just going to say, "Fuck it, I'm not up for this."
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, there are too many people who are going to have concerns about their health or the health of family members. They're just going to do the cost-benefit analysis and say, "I'm out of here," and we're probably going to have a teacher shortage. Maybe we'll even have strikes.
Yeah, I think there might be strikes. This is certainly something that can't go smoothly. I mean, everybody, what you say, wants the schools to reopen. You could reopen the schools, if you had some sort of responsible policy. You dedicated a lot of resources to this with contact tracing and continual testing, building new facilities, and you had some thoughtful policy of how you could run education not by means of the standard classrooms, but you've got the Trumpites, and basically their policy is anything good that happens, Trump takes credit, and everything bad that happens, which is pretty much everything, oh, he's not responsible. Oh, that's for the states, that's for the this, that's for the that. What everybody expected, you just let this fester, the pandemic, and it's going to get worse. And now it is getting worse, and now it's getting worse in the red states, because by and large, they've been the ones that are acting like, oh, we're never going to get it. It's only blacks and Latinos and old people who get it. But now they're starting to get it, and they're starting to have second thoughts. You know, they're basically like, well, if it's bad news and reflects badly on Trump, we don't want to hear it. We're going to act like it doesn't exist. And I tell you, the silver lining here is that I think people are starting to really understand that truth matters, you know, and that trying to make reality secondary to the narrative you want to tell doesn't work. And I expect that to have, if we survive all of this stuff, I expect that to have some really good consequences down the road, medium term. Because I mean, it's become crazy. But the Trumpites have tried to do with this pandemic what they try to do with everything is lie, make up bizarre narratives and blame everybody else, even to the point of, well, you know, you don't wear masks because this is just a conspiracy to hurt Trump. Really, really crazy stuff, and I don't know that people, like, say, outside of the United States can even understand it. You know, clearly we live in a shithole country, to use the term. I mean, Europe is saying no, we're not going to let people from that shithole country even visit our country, right? That's the state to which we've been reduced. So, somebody who takes Marx's work seriously, it seems to me that the Trumpites got themselves into, well, we don't know how to fix this pandemic, and that's not what we're about. You know, we're about placating our base. What we got to do is we got to, you know, win this election. We got to get the stock market numbers higher, and so we got to get the economy moving. And of course, the only way to really get the economy moving successfully is to solve this pandemic. But they don't know how to do it. They don't feel like they want to do it. It's not going to go well, and they don't want to take responsibility for the fact that, like, they're in charge of everything. So they created this false dichotomy of get the economy moving versus do something about the pandemic. So the problem with getting the economy moving is you need people to go to work, and one of the major problems in getting people to go to work is how can they go to work if they've got to take care of their kids at home. So they say, well, okay, well, let's force the kids into school, you know, and force the teachers to take care of the kids so the parents don't have to, and we'll just force. So I don't think it's because they care about education. I don't think it's they care about the intellectual or emotional or social development of the kids. They're just like, you know, warehouse these kids somewhere so that the parents can put their lives under threat, so parents can go out and work and put their lives at threat to pump up this economy at least through November 3rd, you know, and maybe we have a chance of being reelected here. So I think it's very cynical, and I think it's, you know, horribly anti-human, and just shows a profound indifference to human lives and well-being. I think people see this. You know, I know that, you know, I'm not the only person who's seen this, but I think it's pretty widely understood.
Well, that's all the time we have for this current events section. Up next, our main segment, a discussion of Andrew's paper, Not by Politics Alone.
Do you want to maybe start off, Andrew, by just saying, like, why? Do you remember why you wrote this piece? Like, what the context was that prompted you to want to write this?
Yeah, the overall context is, you know, I had been on the left in the revolutionary movement at that point for, I mean, already it was decades. And just I had these nagging doubts that the people around me, the people in the movement generally, were thinking about issues of the creation of a new society, were thinking about it realistically, were aware of the problems. I always got a sense that people would talk about socialism or new society or whatever it might be in almost eschatological religious terms, like heaven, you know, something beyond that we don't really know, but everything's going to be wonderful. And that became increasingly problematic as I saw it in light of, you know, the USSR collapsing and Margaret Thatcher famously saying, Tina, there is no alternative. And this caught on. I mean, you know, it wasn't obvious in 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell, or a few years later when the USSR officially became a private capitalist country. but just became widely accepted that socialism had failed, or communism had failed, or whatever, and that there is no alternative. And you didn't have people really giving much of an effective response to that. And then you've got the global justice movement touched off by the protests in Seattle right around the start of the new millennium, I believe it was, and people saying another world is possible. And you had support for this coming from the movement and the government in Brazil, Lula, and so that became a big thing. Another world is possible. However, what you had were, at that time, a lot of people focused on, especially younger people, what's known as horizontalism, forms of organization, and an emphasis on decision making. And here we're just going to decide to do things differently, and the way we decide will be, horizontal and decentralized and so forth. And look, it was not only younger people, they were just saying the same kinds of things that older people were saying. For instance, the Leninist organization, there were several Leninist organizations. They go back to Daniel Lenin, American socialists. And now it's about 120 years ago or so. I went to one of their panels or something at the Socialist Scholars Conference, Left Forum or something like this. And it was all their thing. And these were older people. These were people who were older than me at the time. Well, they're still older than me. They're still alive. But they were older then than I am now. In many cases, and I'm not a spring chicken, I'm not even a late summer chicken. So it was all about decision making and division of responsibilities, and the idea was just we decide what to do, as if deciding what to do means it gets done and it works. And what bothers me about this, and this is why I say it's religious or eschatological kind of magical thinking, is in people's daily lives they don't talk or act like this at all. Nobody, when they're dealing with a matter that they consider seriously, believes or acts as if deciding on something and implementing that decision is just the answer to everything, as if it's automatically going to work. For a number of reasons, that's why people hire plumbers and they go to doctors and things like that. They don't do it themselves because they want people who can accomplish the thing with knowledge and who have experience and understanding that they don't have.
And Andrew, when you say that the emphasis was on just deciding to do things and then doing it, are you talking about forms of organization and consensus-based or other sorts of democratic organizational forms within activist movements or communities? Or are you talking about those activists deciding to create the world as they want and just sort of by force of will put that world into practice?
Well, various people all have different ideas about form of organization. What's the best form of organization? So you got the people who want decentralized Federation of Workers Councils. You got people who have other ideas. You've got the people who, just think, oh, good, we get to decide for ourselves. We do our own thing. That's pretty common. So all of that, I would say, is one aspect of the focus on decision making. There's another aspect as well, though. The other aspect, the focus on decision-making, is the notion that what we have are distorted priorities in society. You've got politicians and interest groups and the ruling class whose priorities are not all, and what we have to do is decide to do things differently. The decisions that are being made are the wrong decisions for us, and if different decisions are made, that will solve all of our problems.
In some ways, this dovetails with or sounds like or seems analogous to critiques of the Soviet Union that focus just on the political form of organization, the lack of democracy, rather than looking at the mode of production and examining it as a state capitalist society.
Yeah, that's an underlying view, or an articulated view in many cases of a lot of people, that in some way those societies were socialist, if not communist, and that what was wrong with them was only their undemocratic nature, or the fact that they were top down. People would talk about socialism from below instead of socialism from above, or socialism and democracy instead of socialism without democracy. I think all of that is wrong, but we can maybe talk about that. But the problems were not just political, in my view.
So that was the context for this paper you wrote. There was a lot of emphasis on forms of organization. You thought they were bigger, more important questions that needed to be addressed if we were really going to talk about alternatives to capitalism.
Yeah, that was part of it. And also part of it was when people did talk about like actual economic issues that are wrapped up in this whole idea of a new society, there was unreality there. And actually that unreality goes way, way back. It goes far back in the movement. It goes back to the Second International. It's there in Lenin, who was in the main Second International, Marxist. These people just, I think, had a poor understanding of what an economy is. I don't know if you want to get into that, but I think they had a poor understanding of what an economy is, so they did not really grapple with the nature of economic problems. I mean, for instance, Lenin spent a long time talking about accounting and control, and the meaning of that shifted as the problems he faced became real. But this is like coming from something that Engels wrote, and Engels gave this impression. I don't know if Engels really meant it, but it wasn't the smartest thing to have said, which is basically like under socialism, all the economic problems become simple. They become accounting problems, and, anybody with a high school education can add and subtract. And so, there are no economic problems to deal with. It's just a matter of accounting, which is frankly nuts.
So you think Lenin shared with Engels a certain naive assumption about the simplicity of economic problems?
Oh, for sure. If you read, I believe it's The State and Revolution. I've written something on this about a decade or so ago. You read The State and Revolution, and he's getting this from the Second International. He's saying, people say, well, how is socialism possible? He says, we got a fine example of socialism, the postal service.
Right, yeah, he does say that.
So the first thing I say is, obviously, Lenin was not aware of going postal. I said this. I was in Sweden. This was, I don't know, maybe 2007. There was one woman who had been in Los Angeles. She starts to crack up. The other people had no idea what the hell I was talking about. But this is coming from Hilferding or something, that the monopolies, the big oligopolistic corporations are already implicitly socialist. And it's just what's not socialist is the ownership and the control. So we bring them under social ownership and control. And then, we got to sort of knit them together.
Right. Right.
And then that a fully developed system of enterprises all modeled on the postal service, all these monopolistic entities like this, that is socialism. That was Lenin's conception as of 1917.
Yeah.
Okay, it's right there, and it's really naive. But I'm sure there are people who still swear by this. I've heard the craziest things in response to this that I've written, that we're discussing, and everything else. I mean, just like, but the main problem is like people don't want to talk about it. They get really anxious, and again, I think it has to do with this wanting there to be a beyond in which everything's going to be perfect, and we don't have to think about it. Right?
So there's a lot of emphasis in the left today on just building movements, building the left. And not on the sort of envisioning a post-capitalist world. So, make your case for why it's important for people to think now about alternatives to capitalism rather than just like base building.
I think that is the biggest mistake that people make, is to think that we can just make a revolution, have a change in power, and then we got time to work it out and experiment and see what we want. And of course, there'll be new people, and new people will, because they're new people, they're going to solve all the problems by virtue of being new people. So we don't have to give it anything. Well, first of all, I mean, you're going to have the counter-revolution waiting in the wings for any opportunity. And you screw up, and they're going to come right back. We live in a world, it doesn't matter who's in power, or, you say we got rid of capitalism or whatever. We live in a world where you got to produce. You got to distribute what you've produced. That has to happen day in, day out, hour in, hour out. If you say, well, let's experiment, and let's just call a moratorium to all economic activity for 3 weeks while we figure this out. That's even without a counter-revolution waiting in the wings. You wait 3 weeks, you've killed maybe 1 billion people. Okay, so we got to get real about these problems, right? And you can't experiment, because what you do now affects what happens later. I'm not saying there can't be any experimentation, but experimentation is not a solution to these problems, is what I'm saying.
You also, in this essay, you sort of break the question about theorizing an alternative to capitalism into two sort of subsets. One is how you actually break with the capitalist mode of production, but also how this could be sustainable. And I think you were just kind of getting to that. But what does that mean for it to be sustainable? What are sort of the basic parameters involved with that problem?
In this essay that we're discussing, I kind of broke that into two parts. One part has to do with the economic issues concerning sustainability. The other issue is how can a revolution in part of the world sustain itself in the face of, pressures to overthrow it, counter-revolution. I mean, what would obviously solve the problem is world revolution. I mean, that has to be the perspective. The only thing that will ultimately guarantee that we can have a socialist society is socialism, the world over. Socialism in one country ultimately can't work. So the perspective has to be that for world revolution for a lot of reasons, both economic but also political, to fight off the attempt to revert back to capitalism. Okay, but the problem is you're not going to have instantaneous revolution the world over everywhere, So what can be done to defend the places that have or are trying to make a break with capitalism to keep them from reverting so they can then become like a beachhead? I'm not sure if that's the right metaphor, but a place from which the revolution can be extended. Okay, so that's the one issue. And then there are all the questions of economic sustainability.
And just so people are clear, the reason we can't have socialism in one country, you say that it's political and economic, right? That's political in terms of the sense of needing to defend the revolution from other capitalist powers, but it's also economic because there are economic coordination problems that go beyond the borders of countries.
It's partly, yes, economic coordination problems that go beyond the border of countries. But in addition to that, there are the pressures from the world market.
Right.
What are you going to do when you have we can get stuff cheaper and that'll be good for us for a variety of reasons if we import this from, let's say, the United States, which is still capitalist, or we get our oil from Putin's Russia or, natural gas or something like that. So there are those kinds of issues.
In this essay, you talk about a socialist society needing to, quote, deliver the goods. What do you mean by that term?
I don't really know. That's one of those phrases. But among other things, it means that it has to find a way to make sure that people have food on the table, they have shelter, and all of that. In most of the world, obviously, what we also have to do is increase people's standard of living.
Right. Increase people's standard of living, but also their experience of work needs to be one that is not this experience of labor in a capitalist society, right?
Oh, sure. I'm not saying everything is a matter of, output, consumption of output, living standards. There are other things as well that are extremely important. So you mentioned work. The way we do work, safety conditions, whether the work is stupid or fulfilling, and how much we work, how long. Those are very important issues as well. They're not delivered the goods, but that just means deliver the goods is not the all and end all.
I see. So by delivering the goods, you're talking about more like concrete products, commodities that have to be
goods
moved around, not like more abstract quality of life things.
Right. No, it doesn't mean I'm looking at the definition to do something that you've promised to do or expected to do. I didn't mean it in that general sense.
Do you mean
now I see the problem.
Yeah.
I that's not what I meant. I meant actually get the goods
right
to the point of consumption.
Move objects through space and time to people's tables.
Yeah, get them produced.
Gotcha.
Then move them to where they need to go, in space and time.
So you write that, quote, even more importantly, the coordination problem is one thing that makes starkly clear that achieving a new society is not principally a matter of decision-making or politics or forms of organization. So just to be clear, can we clarify why that isn't a problem of just decision-making? Can't we just decide what to produce and where to send it?
Sure, but I mean, what? Let me ask you, what kind of decision making is involved in that process? I mean, most of the process cannot be decision making. Most of that has to be coordination. Okay, I mean, I give it in the essay. I give a simple example. You got a workers' cooperative, and they produce juice, and they want to produce more juice. So we're going to increase our output of juice. Okay, that's great. You got another workers' cooperative that produces cartons and bottles, but the work processes are unsafe and alienating. So they say, let's, get out of this. We're going to do something else instead. We're going to, do landscaping. So they implement that decision. And now there's no cartons and no bottles. And so lo and behold, there's all this juice and nothing to put them in. There's nothing to put the juice in. So you got these decisions and, it becomes a complete mess. You could talk about economic coordination then, so that you've got appropriate quantities of cartons and bottles in which to put appropriate quantities of juice. But now you're not talking about decision making. Now you're talking about taking some more general decision and doing what it takes, not decision making, doing what it takes to make it happen in an effective manner. That's not decision making. And so the greater part of the process and where all the real problems lie is in working out how to get this right. What can be done to make this process of how much to produce, of what kinds, how to get things from one place to another, all kinds of problems like this. That's the real nuts and bolts. That's the real set of issues concern that. At some broad societal level, you have to have social priorities of some sort or another. But the problem with thinking even at that broad societal level that the issues are those of decision making is that we face pretty tight economic constraints. We can't have everything and do everything all at once, without regard to the resources that we have, including the people that we have, and so forth and so on. So choices have to be made that, recognize these constraints, and the choices have to be consistent with one another, right? So just like you can't have a thing work where you're producing a lot more juice and no bottles and cartons, that's not consistent. There's other things as well. I used to teach economics, and I know how people talk, and they go, well, we need to maximize this and maximize that and maximize the other thing. You can't maximize everything at once. Okay, so you have to work out what's optimal in some larger sense such that the whole coheres. For instance, at any time we're going to have the people that we have with the knowledge that we have, the natural resources and the produced materials that we have, and we can think about cutting down working time, and we can think about making work processes less safe, and we can think about enhancing people's standard of living, especially in the less developed countries. But you can't do all of this to the maximum all at once. The more you do of one, the less you do of the other.
Let's talk a little bit more about that, about the standard of living on the world scale, and how this factors into these dual competing tensions. Because on one hand, we want to reduce poverty and have equality of standards of living across the world in some future socialist world society, but we also want to reduce people's working time and reduce onerous work and dehumanizing work. So what are the trade-offs here? And how close is our current productive capacity able to deliver something, as you call, sustainable? How far are we from that with our current abilities?
Right. I first want to say something about the first point that you mentioned, about reducing poverty throughout the world. Even if we don't want it, it's a big issue. And it's a big issue in something that seems far removed from this, perhaps, which is the climate crisis.
Yeah.
Okay. India, China, they're saying, you guys got yours. We're trying to develop, we're trying to industrialize. You guys use coal, we're going to use coal.
Yeah.
And
you guys have AC, we're going to have AC.
Yeah, right. you're not going to get a buy-in, so to speak, from the less developed countries for the reconstruction of society if you just go, okay, well, we'll do it over here, and you can worry about you. So we've seen what's happening with regard to climate, and it's really hard. I don't like the rulers of those countries, especially China and India, but they make a valid argument in this case. So it's something we have to do even if we don't feel like doing it, because you're just not going to have support for the socialist reconstruction without that. Okay, but to get to your question, how far away are we from that? Well, when I wrote this essay, which was about, I don't know,
13 years, 2006, right? So 13 years ago.
13 years ago. So I went online and I crunched a few of the numbers, and at that point, what I found is that the production, the output per person, the average, output or income in the world was 22% of the average in the United States. Okay, so let's say average income. So that's less than a quarter. I remember crunching the numbers at one point since then, and the numbers hadn't changed substantially. So I don't know, maybe now it might be 26% of the U.S. average, but maybe it's 21%. It will not have changed substantially. So that's about where we are, and that means if you think of redistribution as the solution to all of our economic problems, you're saying the solution to all of our economic problems is to have everybody in the world live at about 1/4 of the standard of living of the average in person, in the United States, which ain't the most desirable situation that I can think of.
Right. Well, it's a hard sell.
Yeah.
It's hard, even if you thought ideologically that was fair, that's a hard sell.
That's why it's better to ignore these kinds of issues, for some politics, and to just promise that redistribution will solve everything.
And if we go back to the climate question, I mean, this is sort of an abstract question because standard of living isn't directly the equivalent of like carbon footprint or energy consumption. But it would be hard to imagine. I mean, already our current standard of living is ecologically catastrophic, and it'd be hard to imagine the entire planet rise into like the standard of consumption in the United States and still have some kind of hope for preserving a civilization from like a climate apocalypse.
Yeah, I think that's a real difficult issue because the standard of living of like the average, household person in the United States is not that great. People live paycheck to paycheck. And if that is not even sustainable on a global level, I mean,
well, tell me what does standard of living encompass as an economic indicator? Is it like the amount of commodities, the bundle of like consumer goods that you buy per income? Is that what it describes?
Okay, standard of living is kind of a general term. It's not a specific indicator. The closest indicator that is actually measurable and measured that I could think of would be real income.
Okay.
Yeah, real income. And real income means not your income in money terms, but how much stuff you can get with that income. What level of goods and services do people's incomes allow them to have?
I'm just thinking out loud, but I think there's so many things about my own standard of living that are so gratuitous and decadent. I mean, the fact that I can like order whatever I want on my computer and it just arrives on my doorstep within a day or two, or that I can like get in a car and drive anywhere, get in an airplane anytime I want and go anywhere. I mean, ecologically speaking, I can't imagine if everyone had the expectation in the world and the ability to do that. I think it was their right to have that level of consumption.
Or the people should want. I mean, one of the craziest things that I've seen and lived through, because I participated in it, is people living so far from where they work.
Right. Yeah.
So it's not good at all. You travel, 45 minutes. I traveled, and my father did it as well. I mean, we lived near Washington, D.C., and he traveled every day to Baltimore and back.
Wow.
5 days a week for decades. And what was it? I don't know, 40 miles away or something like that. And there are people with even longer commutes. And then,
Even within the same city. I mean,
yeah,
people that
sure.
drive an hour, they live in the city they work in, but it's an hour of commuting.
Sure. And this is a complete waste, and it's very, tiring to people. It's among the reasons people are, so worn out. And I mean, we don't need any of that kind of stuff, but you then have to talk about the designing communities.
Yeah.
The
construction
and
of
this is,
space.
that's not the capitalist way where you just let it all hang out, and of course the decentralized decisions that individuals make is going to be good for everybody as if by an invisible hand. I mean, just like nutty, crazy argumentation like that. We've seen that with the internet, right? Just let the internet just happen. No regulation. It'll all be wonderful.
Yeah, what could go wrong?
Vladimir Putin would threaten the whole world, and Donald Trump would be elected president, et cetera, et cetera. It'd all be great, yeah. So, look, there are a lot of problems that can be solved in part with different priorities and judicious planning and decision making. Not everything. I mean, definitely not everything. You can't talk about socialism just by talking about making better decisions and having better priorities. But there is a lot that could be done, let's say, to maintain and even enhance the standard of living in developed countries, places like the United States, with much less of an environmental footprint than we now have.
Hey, I hope you're enjoying the interview. I certainly am. In just a few moments, we will continue with this interview. But first, a few words from Anja Clark, Organizational Secretary of Marxist-Humanist Initiative, the organization which sponsors this podcast.
Hello, this is Anja Clark, Organizational Secretary of Marxist-Humanist Initiative. Marxist-Humanist Initiative, or MHI, aims to contribute to the transformation of this capitalist world by projecting, developing, and concretizing the philosophy of Karl Marx and its further development in the Marxist humanism articulated by Raya Dunayevskaya. We are not a political party, nor are we trying to lead the masses, whose emancipation must be their own act. But we have seen that spontaneous actions alone are insufficient to usher in a new society. We seek a new unity of philosophy and organization in which mass movements striving for freedom lay hold of Marx's philosophy of revolution and recreate society on its basis. Today's political, economic, and environmental crises present a moment to engage people in discussion of these ideas. MHI is dedicated to the task of proving theoretically that an alternative to capitalism is possible. We are distinguished by our economic analyses, which demonstrate that the only opposite to the current world economic system is its abolition and replacement with one not based on the production of, quote, value. Because capitalism cannot be fundamentally reformed, attempts to reform it lead to an intensification of state capitalism, not socialism. MHI's ideas and actions, as well as our structure and rules, are guided by the interests of working people and freedom movements, of people of color, LGBTQ people, other minorities, youth, and all those around the world who are struggling for self-determination in order to freely develop their own human natures. We have no interests separate and apart from theirs. We intend to practice, as well as espouse, a two-way road between our organization and people outside it as essential to developing a single dialectic in the relationship of theory to practice.
So one of the things you're working on in this essay or talking about is describing a non-capitalist way of coordinating these questions. What principle would be the coordinating principle? What would be the coordinating principles if we weren't doing it? What would actually make this sort of coordination not capitalist?
Well, what capitalist coordination is in the classical, typical case is it works without any societal decision making. It's very decentralized. It operates through markets. And this whole idea of an invisible hand is that despite this seeming anarchy, it all works out. To some extent, that's the case. But the way I I always think of it is capitalism is like, a bad doc. Capitalism seems to work at all because it buries its mistakes. So companies go under, people lose their jobs, all kinds of disasters and things happen, but that gets hidden from view. So what's left, what survives, there's a lot of waste of human beings and resources and everything involved in this. The strong survive and the weak perish. And, we're talking about people, and we're talking about 90% of new businesses fail and all kinds of things like that. So in any case, the coordination in kind of ideal capitalist cases through markets, and the idea of a market is everything's got a price, and if you are willing and able to pay that price, you get it. If not, you don't get it. And so nobody is entitled to anything, and nobody is required to provide for anybody. And you solve the problems of the constraints that we face by putting prices on things, and things that are more scarce command higher prices, so they're hard to get. They require more use of your income, more use of your resources, and things that are plentiful have a low price. That's a thumbnail sketch of what a market system is supposed to be.
Right. So what are we replacing this with then?
Well, we can't have markets in that sense. Obviously we can have things like supermarkets, right? Places where you get goods, but we have to have a system. If socialism is anything, it's got to be a system where we're all in this together, and we're responsible for one another, and we are meeting at least each other's basic needs. Hopefully we'll do a lot beyond that. People are entitled to things, obviously under certain conditions, and if they contribute in various adequate ways that we can talk about. So we have responsibilities to every individual, and each individual has certain things to which they're entitled. So at this point, you're no longer talking about prices, and what that means is that you just can't use markets to coordinate. So you have to find other ways to coordinate, right? And in other words, let's take this juice and bottle carton, stupid example, right? So you got this one enterprise that's expanding its production of juice. You got another enterprise, and let's imagine these are the only two, and they're moving into landscaping instead of producing bottles and cartons. Okay, what would happen in a market system is the price of cartons and bottles, the prices of those things would go sky high. That would be an inducement for other people to shift out of whatever they're doing and start to produce bottles and cartons. And the price would go up to such a point where the needed amount of bottles and cartons were forthcoming, or the juice producers would say, oh my God, this is costing us too much to put all this juice in bottles and cartons. Let's cut down on how much juice we produce. Some combination of that would result. And most of microeconomics is about exactly what would be, the shifts taking place and how. Okay, so it's all got to match in the end. In other words, the supply has to match the demand. Supply of cartons and bottles has to match the enterprise that produces the juice, right? Their demand for cartons and bottles. And so something's got to give. The amount of demand is too big. The amount of supply is too small. In a market system, the movements in the price, at least in the ideal case, the movements in the price solve the problem until the quantities that are supplied and demanded match. We have to do things different. There's, participatory economics, Paricon, developed by Michael Albert and Robin Hennell. This has some, criticisms of what they've done. I think it's, a good way of thinking about a lot of these economic issues, this participatory economics. There are some problems with what they say, but I think that they really have done most of what's needed in terms of laying the foundation for solving the coordination problem. Basically, it's not that hard. It's a set of technical problems, and requires a lot of information.
Is the goal of the technical, whatever the sort of coordination solution is the goal to come up with the same result that the market would have come up with?
No. And yes.
Because it's not just a question of okay, the market can do this without it being planned. So we're just going to create a plan that does the same thing as the market, but we're not going to call it prices. We're going to have a different sort of metrics, but they're going to create the same results. It's not quite that It's not, that is not the goal that we're trying to get to here.
No, and yes. Let me try to break this down. Okay. First of all, any of this coordination has to work under the general framework of certain social goals. Okay, so you might want to say, well, we have to have next year, next 5 years, whatever, an X% increase in our resource base. We have to invest, let's say, 3% a year for the next 5 years. And we want to provide everybody with a 2% increase in their standard of living. Other such things as well. So you have those general societal goals. Okay, and then you know to some extent what your production capabilities are. From that, you can figure out what the options are subject to those constraints. So we've got the goals, we've got the resource base, stuff like that. Okay, and then given all of that, what you are trying to do is to get some modicum of efficiency, which in this case basically means you got to match the supplies to the demands. I mean, how much labor of varying kinds different individuals are willing to supply, how much they consume, take out, how much of this gets produced, how much of that gets produced, so forth and so on. I mean, everything in the end has got to be matched. Otherwise, you're going to have people trying to produce and they need O-rings and there are no O-rings. So things have got to be matched like that. And the way to match them is to get what people are willing not to take or, not to consume, what they're willing to give. What you have to do is match these things by altering certain scarcity indexes. Okay. So for instance, let's say we say, okay, we want to, have more coal, but nobody wants to go down in the mines and work, digging coal. Okay. So you want it, we as a society say, yeah, let's have more coal. I don't know why we would want to say that, but let's say we, in China and India, they might want to say that. Okay, but nobody wants to go down in the mines and dig the coal. So if you got like a free society like this, what's going to happen is you're not going to force people into the mines at gunpoint, nor are you going to do what is done in the classic capitalist case. They're poor, and they got no alternatives, so they go down into the mines. What you'll do is say, okay, gee, we don't have people who want to go in the mine. So the scarcity index, and it's called a shadow price, but it's not a price. Okay, I want to make that clear. It's not a price, not in any real sense of the word. It's a scarcity. The scarcity index for coal would go sky high. Okay, scarcity index for coal mining labor would go sky high. Okay, and at that point, people would say, okay, well, we want this coal, but we can't have it. It's too scarce. We could have, a little bit of coal, but then we wouldn't have food on the table. We wouldn't have a car or whatever. We'll do with something else. So there are myriad such things going on like this. You would have several iterations in which people would be responding to these signals that, you take all of these individualized, might be partly individual household by individual household, might be individual enterprises, production units, all kinds of smaller units like this. And they would be saying, okay, here's what we want. Here's what we're willing to offer. Okay. And they'd be responding to these scarcity indexes and making adjustments in light of them until the whole thing meshes.
And it's not a price because why?
Because nobody's actually paying anything. They're not giving up resources to get anything.
I see.
Another way of putting it is among the functions that prices fill is to provide information concerning scarcity.
Right. Okay.
Okay. So these scarcity indexes fulfill that function without being prices because they don't have any of the other characteristics of prices.
I see. What does that term come from?
This comes from, and everything that participatory economics comes from comes from this old debate. Goes, I don't know, over 100 years at this point, called the Socialist Calculation debate. Or here's the gist of it. In, I don't know, the 1870s, a guy named Léon Varras showed, so to speak, that a decentralized private ownership market economy could be efficient, not in a laudatory sense of efficient, but just it could solve this coordination problem. Okay, it could match the supplies to the demand. That's all we're talking about. It could match the supplies to the demand. So this, in principle, can be done in a decentralized private ownership ownership market economy. Whether it could actually be done is a whole other issue. Okay, now some people have taken that through the years to mean, it can only be done in that manner, decentralized market private. That's not the case at all. That's not what he showed. And so you began to get, in the decades after, a question of whether a planned socialist economy could do the same thing, without markets, without prices, without this decentralization and so forth. Is there another way to match the supplies and the demand? And generally, the answer that everybody thought was, the answer is yes. Hayek, the libertarians said, no, because you need prices to provide the information, and the central planners would not get the adequate information. Okay, so then, I don't know, in the 1980s, something like this, Albert and Hanel come along with participatory economics, and they say, you don't need centralized planning in the sense of you got planners to do the planning. And nowadays, the information problem is really something that can be solved without markets, because we got computers, and now, I don't know, 30-something years later, it's so much easier, even when they were talking about it, for people to be providing information. Here's how I respond to the fact that the scarcity index of coal is sky high. Maybe I want to go work in the mine, because what's being offered to do that is you can respond. You can respond pretty quickly and so forth. So the information that we need is there, and it probably wasn't circa 1950 or 1960 or 1970, or the age of PCs and the whole infrastructure for electronic communications. So you need some computer power to crunch the numbers, but we got that, yeah. But this is really like the equivalent of accounting and control, this kind of stuff. Once you've got what people are willing to offer to do, what's then available, you total it all up, and then you just need some judicious tweaking. You send back information and say, okay, well, we're going to raise the scarcity index of this kind of work, of this kind of good, lower it for this kind of work, this kind of good. You got a new iteration, and people respond to that. It's not it's not rocket science. Okay.
So if it's not rocket science, why do you so the premise of the paper, your Not Politics Alone essay, is that people haven't been dealing with these questions.
Right. I mean, I basically, look, there are really difficult questions to grapple with, unsolved questions. The economic coordination problem is not one of those.
Gotcha.
But it's hugely important because it's just absolutely necessary. And what I'm trying to do is induce a different mode of thinking whereby people get out of this. We just have to have different priorities. We don't want any coal, or we do want coal, but we don't want to work in the coal mines. You have to have consistency. You have to have supplies and demands matching. That's not a matter of decision making. And so I'm just trying to induce a shift away from that kind of thinking. Not that the coordination problem cannot be solved or is even that difficult to solve. It's not. The other problems are huge, unsolved.
These are the questions like we were discussing earlier about the standard of living globally, socialism in one country.
Yeah, how to deal with the constraints that we face, the trade-offs that we have to make, because, again, if we just redistribution is not a solution to everything. You just redistribute. We're living at, I don't know, something like a quarter of the average standard of living in the U.S. Or you say, okay, well, we'll have planned communities, and so we won't be driving all this way, and we won't have, so many plastic shells that we'll eat things, from stuff that's wrapped in paper. And you can increase the standard of living a little bit by doing that. But I do sort of a thought experiment in the essay, and I say, factor in all of this stuff, all kinds of waste, the kind of waste from, just living so far from where you work, and the packaging, and the waste of all the resources devoted to advertising and marketing, and et cetera, et cetera. Factor in some revolutionary enthusiasm because everybody's so enthused to be part of a new society. Do this, do that, do the other thing. You might be able to double or triple. Maybe, the outside maximum case, you might be able conceivably to triple what that 22%. So we would all be living at 66%, 2/3 of the average standard of living in the U.S. Okay, and then you at that point you can't say, oh yeah, but we wouldn't have this capitalist waste. That's already factored in there. So people like in the United States have to say, is that what we want? A 1/3 reduction in how well we live in terms of consumption. There's other things as well, well, right? How fulfilling our work is, how safe it is, how long we work. There's other issues as well. But in terms of the amounts of stuff that we consume, to me, maximum imaginable is that changing social priorities, getting rid of the waste, redistribution, et cetera, that could bring the average standard of living throughout the world, how much stuff we consume to the outside guess is 2/3 of the U.S. average. And we got to deal with that. So we got problems of constraints. And because we have problems of constraints, we do not have a situation in which famously we have a society in which from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs. That's not what we have because we have not unlimited amounts essentially to go around. People hear this and use this phrase from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs. And I guess in many cases they just think, it refers to a society in which we take care of people's needs. It doesn't mean that at all. It's an incredibly futuristic utopian conception. From each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs. That means that we are breaking any link in that kind of a futuristic utopian situation. We're breaking any link, all links whatsoever, between what people contribute and what they receive. They receive according to their needs. They contribute without regard to what they receive according to their ability. You can only have that, and Marx obviously recognized this right when he said what it would take to have such a situation for society to put that on its banners from each according to their ability, each according to their needs. We'd have to have untold plenty. Otherwise, you can't just say you receive just in accordance with your needs and people freely contribute without regard to what they're going to get. Why? Because they got everything that they need, right? So we're not going to have that kind of society for the foreseeable future, maybe not ever. This has long been known. Lenin in the State and Revolution says, we can't promise this. Who knows whether it's going to happen. He's absolutely right about that. So you can't talk, if you talk about, getting rid of capitalism and having socialism, you're not talking about immediately having that kind of a society. It's just not feasible. So you've got these constraints, you've got these trade-offs, and so what we need is a non-capitalist system, an entirely different way of matching receipts and contributions. Okay, in a capitalist society, you receive according to the prices that you can command, the wages that you can command, the prices for your goods that you command. You receive that, and you give in accordance with what people are willing to offer you. Okay, we can't have that. I mean, we have it, but it's not good at all.
Well, this has been a great conversation, Andrew. I think we've really touched on a lot of points, material that is not often brought up when people talk about envisioning alternatives to capitalism.
I mean, a lot of people on the left always focus on building a movement. You get the movement and you get big, and somehow that's going to, solve the problem because we take over. I mean, so that goes to the issues of, is it the case that different people in power and different social priorities are going to solve all of the problems? Well, no. There are other things involved as well, such as you can get big, but if you don't have the right conceptions, it all come crashing down in a situation like the outbreak of World War I, where you had this huge social democracy in Germany, and yet they go off in an imperialist, chauvinist direction. But beyond that, this idea that, we can just leave everything to the future, different people, and experimentation, and it all work out, this is not convincing to most people. This is not the way most people think. And it's not just a right-wing Republican talking point to say, how would this future society work? Could it work? Most people are not going to put their lives on the line and sacrifice to change society if they think that it's not feasible and they have no idea what the alternative is supposed to be. Okay, yes, you get a lot of people on the left like that. This is kind of the characteristic of left-wing people, but they're not the majority, and they don't have much success in recruiting other people in any large amounts because other people are much more realistic about certain things, at least. So we have to address these questions because everybody can see it's a dodge. Everybody can see it's an evasion of the issues to just talk about, we'll have completely different people, we'll have revolutionary enthusiasm and people change, and we'll experiment. It's all hand waving. It just indicates that you don't know what you're talking about. Everybody can see you don't know what you're talking about. You discredit yourselves. So it's time to get real.
Hey, and that's all the time we have for this episode of Radio Free Humanity. If you like the podcast, or if you don't like the podcast, please let us know. Send us a comment. Tell your friends and enemies all about it. You can subscribe. We have an RSS feed and all the things that every other podcast has. If you want to know more about some of the things that we've touched on here, you should go read Andrew's paper for yourself. It's called Not by Politics Alone. You can find it on Marxist-Humanist Initiative.org, where you can also find lots of other great things written by Andrew and other people.